The nation of Belarus. If it was a playable country in Sid Meier's Civilization or in a Paradox game, its special ability would be media invisibility. Belarus doesn't appear in the news, it doesn't show up in movies or video games. It's like the country is concealed by some sort of an experimental Soviet cloaking technology. Modern-day Belarus is a medium-sized independent nation on the westernmost edge of the Russian world, wedged between Poland, Ukraine, and Russia itself. Looking at the map, you might assume its strategic location would make Belarus a subject of research and intrigue in the neo-Cold War context. But no, the think tanks don't seem to care. The cloaking device is clearly working. The major economic sectors of Belarus are service industries, manufacturing, as well as scamming Vlad Putin by promising him various political concessions, such as an allied state with Russia, which will totally happen any day now. President Lukashenko whispers sweet nothings into Putin's ear, and in return he gets fairly good economic benefits. With Russia being what it is, the benefits come primarily in the form of oil and gas concessions. Minsk was importing millions of tons of tax-free oil from Russia, and then subsequently reselling it abroad at global prices. Putin eventually figured everything out and put an end to it, but it was a nice scam while it lasted. Some months ago, as the coronavirus epidemic was spreading, the nations of the world began to take it more seriously with the lockdowns, closed borders, closed businesses, etc. And due to these and other circumstances, I kind of got stuck in Belarus. I quickly discovered that nobody in the country, or rather nobody in Belarusian government, believed in coronavirus. Lukashenko dismissed the pandemic as psychosis and encouraged Belarusians to fight it by drinking vodka and going to sauna. Until recently, Western media would refer to Alexander Lukashenko as Europe's last dictator, a quaint expression from the boomer era. In the world of Tom Clancy, political leaders can be either dictators or non-dictators. It's a boomer boolean. Of course, we millennials are way more intelligent and sophisticated than the simple-minded boomers that preceded us. I, for one, can identify over 24 different variations of authoritarianism. Dictator, please. Is he a dictator like Kim Jong-un? Or like Lee Kuan Yew? Or like Putin? Or like Mr. House? Or maybe Caesar? Or the other Caesar? As recent developments have shown, Lukashenko is a Soviet simpleton kind of dictator. That's my favorite kind. So, since the government of Belarus refused to believe in corona, there was no lockdown. Or at least the lockdown wasn't government-imposed. Many people made an individual choice to self-isolate. Some stores and businesses had to close because of the lack of customers. The economy tanked. But the gyms were still open, which is a great thing for me because my main hobby is picking up heavy things and putting them back on the ground. At first I was disappointed about being stuck in Belarus, but then I realized this is exactly where I want to be. From a safe distance, I've observed the aboriginal Belarusian man. I listened to his conversations. I've learned facts about the political situation in the country, and I bring these facts to you. But first, we have to talk history. The region that is now Belarus was initially settled by Baltic and Slavic tribes in whatever century BC, it doesn't really matter, with the former eventually being assimilated by the latter. In the 9th century, the territory of modern Belarus became a part of Kievan Rus, an East Slavic state ruled by a Scandinavian dynasty. One of the most ancient cities of Eastern Slavs is a place called Polotsk. Today it's a smallish town in Belarus with a population of around 80,000 people. But in the medieval times, Polotsk used to be a big deal. The most famous ruler of Polotsk was a man named Vseslav the sorcerer. Some folk tales depict him as a werewolf, others as a volhva, a warrior with a magical aptitude, kind of like a witcher. The favorite pastime of Eastern Slavic princes was fighting each other. Eventually this will lead to their downfall. Vseslav was no different in that respect. He raided and pillaged the northern areas of Kievan Rus. In the winter of 1066, he burned Novgorod the Great, looting its most holy temple, called the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom. He stole the temple's bell and brought it back to Polotsk to decorate his own cathedral, which was incidentally also called the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom. Isn't it weird? It's like they build stuff from the same template, like in Age of Empires. I guess all Kievan Slavs belong to the same faction, so they are restricted to the same tech tree. Makes sense to me. Furthermore, I believe this makes Novgorod Belarusian clay de jure. Polotsk Cathedral of Holy Wisdom remains one of the oldest monuments in modern Belarus. For someone who supposedly had pagan sympathies, Vseslav sure put a lot of effort into this Orthodox temple. It seems he had a mercenary attitude towards the gods, and back then, the Orthodox bog was the hottest shit. Vseslav was extremely based and cool. In fact, he was too cool for other Kievan princes who eventually got sick of his fuckery, joined forces and marched north, defeating the sorcerer in Battle of the Nemiga River. Vseslav fled, possibly by shapeshifting into a wolf, but was treacherously captured during the peace talks in June, when one of the princes violated his oath. The sorcerer was taken to Kiev, where he spent a year in the dungeon. But then he got lucky again. His captor suffered a military defeat at the hands of the nomadic Kipchaks. There was an uprising. The crowd freed Vseslav from prison and proclaimed him Grand Prince of Kiev, where he ruled for 7 months before being chased away back to Polotsk. Centuries later, the city was incorporated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was annexed militarily, but a significant portion of the land that is now Belarus would join the Commonwealth without coercion. The Mongol invasion that devastated the Slav lands might have had something to do with it. Belarus was spared, but safety was a concern. For a few hundred years, pretty much up to the late modern period, the fate of Belarus was linked to Poland and Lithuania. Polish language and Catholicism would eventually become dominant, and in 1696 it was made an official language. In 1795, Poland was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Belarusian territories were acquired by the Russian Empire. The national culture was repressed. Policies of Polonization were replaced by Russification, which included the return to Orthodox Christianity. Belarusian language was banned in schools. Cyrillic script was reintroduced in 1864. In 1919, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic became a thing. Statistically, it was the hardest-hit Soviet republic in World War II. The Germans were not kind to Belarusians. 209 out of 290 cities were destroyed. The Slavic population of Belarus did not regain its pre-war level until 1971, and the Jewish population never made a recovery. Through its entire history, Belarus was a plaything of stronger regional powers. From paganism to orthodoxy to Polonization to Catholicism to Russification to orthodoxy again, Latin to Cyrillic, Lebensraum and finally Sovietization, the policy implemented by Stalin in order to isolate Belarus from the West. Sovietization was often synonymous with Russification, since in many cases it included the adoption of Russian language. "The sooner we all start speaking Russian, the faster we shall build communism," said Khrushchev. In 1986, Belarus was exposed to significant nuclear fallout from the explosion at the Chernobyl power plant in the neighboring Ukraine. The Chernobyl event is often seen as the beginning of end of the Second Russian Empire. In 1991, representatives from Belarus, Ukraine and Russia met in Belovezhskaya Pushcha to formally declare the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Located on the border between Belarus and Poland, Belovezhskaya Pushcha, or Bielovezha Forest, is one of the last and largest remaining parts of the immense primeval forest that once stretched across Europe until it was tamed by the industrial civilization. It seems fitting that this was the place where the USSR ceased to be. Forests and woodland spirits played an important role in Slavic mythology, the original one. Before the new Soviet man, before the victory cult, before the Greek religious dogma, they were here, the spirits of the forest, the gods of the grove. After the 1994 presidential election, Alexander Lukashenko became a leader of Belarus, a position he still holds to this day. He was quite literally a nobody. Lukashenko worked as a director of a collective farm, a kolkhoz, and served in the Soviet border troops. He was the only deputy of the Belarusian parliament to vote against the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union. That certainly explains why so much of the Soviet symbolism still remains in modern Belarus. It's a part of his aesthetic. He is a man of the people. Belarus grew economically under Lukashenko, but much of this growth was due to Russian crude oil, which was imported at below market prices and sold to other European countries at a profit. The quality of life is not quite on the level of Poland, the Baltics, or Russia, but it is higher than in economically ruined Ukraine. The special relationship with Russia worked out quite well for the country and its president. For a long time, Lukashenko continued with a policy of Russification. Russian language was formalized as official. But as years went by, something began to change. Back in Russia, some conservative journalists were starting to notice strange behavior of their Belarusian colleagues, show too much enthusiasm towards a common Russian-Belarusian identity and the allied state, and you might attract the attention of Belarusian KGB. Alexander, are you okay? What's going on, big guy? You aren't trying to weasel out of our allied state, are you? In 2014, following the Russian annexation of Crimea, Lukashenko for the first time delivered a speech in Belarusian language in which he said, "We are not Russian, we are Belarusians." But then in 2019, when Lukashenko had bilateral talks in Sochi with Russian President Vladimir Putin, he declared that their two countries could unite tomorrow, no problem. Alexander Lukashenko is a very flexible man. The Belarusian language, long suppressed, is now making a recovery. The process is slow. Some street signs, some ads, metro announcements are in Belarusian, but nothing else is.
Доступная станция «Спас» Шерушница. Осторожно, двери зачиняются. Next station is «Спас» Шерушница. Please mind the closing doors.
Actual flesh and blood Belarusians speak Russian language pretty much exclusively. The name Belarus itself literally means white Rus, but nobody really knows for sure why it's called white. One theory suggests the name was used to describe the part of old Ruthenian lands that had been populated mostly by Christian Slavs, as opposed to pagans who lived in Black Ruthenia. Or perhaps this is a reference to traditional white clothing worn by Belarusians and Ukrainians. Or maybe white references the parts of Kiev and Rus that were not conquered by the Mongol invaders. But the name has no connection to the events of the Russian Civil War, the Whites, the Reds, or anything like that. Whatever the etymological origin, Belarus is exactly what it says on the label. It's like Russia, but white. Russians and Belarusians have an ongoing mini-culture war over the country's proper name. Russians insist on calling it Belorussia. Belarusians, and the rest of the world, call it Belarus. People get mad over stuff like this in the social media. Russian culture is in full retreat in much of the post-Soviet space. This reality makes the Russians uncomfortable and insecure in a toxic X kind of way, so they lash out, even further alienating their former comrades. This is how Ukraine happened. Come to think of it, Belarus is exactly what the online Nazis think Russia is like. Somewhat poor, somewhat conservative, not the best place to live, but not the worst. Demographically, the nation consists of Belarusians, Russians, Ukrainians, with a small but statistically notable Polish minority. It's essentially an East Slavic ethno-state. The only non-Slav minority you encounter with some consistency are small groups of Chinese university students. Belarusian people have less horizontal diversity compared to Russians. There are fewer Eurasian faces, but there are still some. Having visited over 24 cities and towns back in the motherland, I can claim with some degree of authority that there are many places in actual Russia that feel a lot less Russian than Belarus. I'm not sure if I was glad or disappointed to discover this. Another thing that differentiates Belarusians from Russians is that the former are absolutely crazy about their embroidered shirt patterns. Ukrainians are also like that. Embroidered shirt is a national costume. The pattern is supposed to represent the sun, I think. Ukrainians supposedly inherited it from Scythians who already had a similar artistic style in the 5th century BC. In the modern times, Eastern Slavic embroidered shirts and patterns became a political statement and even a sort of an anti-Russian gesture? This sounds stupid, but it's actually pretty significant. Following the Donbass war, and arguably even before that, the act of wearing an embroidered shirt became a symbolic display of Ukrainian cultural sovereignty and patriotism. The Russians absolutely seethe at the sight of those. They know what's up. Belarusians are not quite as crazy as Ukrainians when it comes to embroidery, but it is an important element of their fall costume, part of tradition, history, a thing that differentiates them from their neighbors to the east. And sure, the costumes look nice enough. Look at this one, it's like a Slav hijab. Belarusian people are internationally known for their rich cuisine that consists of rye bread and sushi. Wikipedia suggests Belarusians are fond of borscht, shi, and other traditional Slav soups, but I am yet to find any of these items on sale in any store. This is a stark contrast with Russia, where there is a dozen of popular borscht brands. In the Slav world, Belarus is famous for its potatoes. There is even an old Soviet slur that pejoratively refers to Belarusians as potato people. What the hell, man? I thought racism was abolished in the USSR. The local stores are full of Belarusian, Russian, and Polish products. In that order. I expected to see more Ukrainian stuff, but no, there is almost nothing. In a few months I've been here in Minsk, I've seen more alcoholics than in the last 5 years in Russia. In his speeches, Lukashenko keeps talking about the importance of sports and maintaining good health. So the top scientists of Belarus developed a domestic line of fitness supplements, most notable of which is called Biophone Bear. Based on an ancient beverage consumed by Slavic bogatyr heroes of old, this protein supplement is produced out of cow milk, sugar, and possibly bear sperm. Brown bears, majestic creatures, are captured by hunters in Belarusian forests. They are then transported to bear farms, where trained specialists jack them off to produce the finest bear semen in the world, the key to Belarusian athletic success. Seems unlikely that a nation that invested in such a nectar can be conquered by an enemy. You and your Eurasian horde can fuck right off, Vlad. Nobody in the West cares enough about Belarus to develop a strategy on how to interact with the country. Sometimes they'll place sanctions, sometimes they'll lift them, giving Lukashenko legitimacy and a room to maneuver in his negotiations with the Russians. I suppose being a politician is about telling people what they want to hear, but Alexander Lukashenko takes this to a new level. Today he would pivot to the West, and then the next day he would go back to Putin, promising him Belarusian sovereignty in exchange for economic aid. And then he would pivot to the West again. Now he is anti-Russian for real. Lukashenko has been doing this for almost 3 decades now. He will no doubt win the upcoming fraudulent election, but the scale of the demonstrations show that something broke in Lukashenko political machine. According to the official polls, his approval rating is around 24%, which is a catastrophically low number for a supposed dictator. What's worse is that independent online polling shows his approval rating at 3%, although I'm not sure how trustworthy this number is. In the Eastern Slavic world, the opposition manufactures statistics just as much as their government does. Well, plus there is self-selection. However, the authorities have inadvertently legitimized these polls by shutting down the sites that were conducting them. 2 prominent opposition leaders and scores of activists have been arrested. Lukashenko claimed to have thwarted a foreign plot to destabilize the country, a plot by Russia no less. One of the arrested candidates was revealed to be a puppet under the control of big bosses in Gazprom, a Russian state company. The protests followed soon after. Thousands of people formed a human chain several kilometers long in the center of Minsk. Hundreds of protesters and journalists were beaten by the riot police. But since then, even soldiers and some cops have joined the movement by anonymously sharing photos on social media displaying 3% signs. I've seen this before, in Ukraine. The fate of the potato kingdom hangs in the balance. Or maybe not. Eastern European autocrats who survived for this long are good at not being deposed. But even an autocrat needs to legitimize his rule somehow. This is usually done via economic accomplishment, raising salaries, pensions, standards of living. But the era of easy growth based off Russian oil has ended. The main complaint I'm hearing is poverty. Belarusian people are very poor and they are tired of it. Well, that's the talk around the gym anyway, which is the medium through which I explore politics these days. One middle-aged guy who obviously didn't discover weightlifting until he was 35 angrily complained that he never in his entire life has seen a sea or an ocean. Belarus is a landlocked country. For many older people who grew up in the USSR, a visit to a sea resort is a memorable experience. It's a prestige kind of thing, a proof that you are not a complete loser. To spend your entire life working at a shitty government job for scraps, while a potato dictator instructs you to cure the plague with vodka shots, without ever seeing the sea. The person he was talking to was an old Soviet trainer with a number of health problems. "The doctors told me I can't lift anything heavier than a glass," he says. Despite being in a different age group, he disliked Lukashenko just as much. In fact, I'm yet to meet a single individual who would show any respect for Lukashenko. His man-of-the-people aesthetic is losing its magic, or so it would seem. Once they run out of money to pay the cops, he's a goner, says the trainer. "Do you know that American gyms don't have mirrors anymore? They removed all the mirrors," the trainer keeps going. "Do you know why? Because Americans were admiring themselves too much," he said. "They weren't working out. That's why they had to remove the mirrors." Belarusian people don't quite get capitalism. It's not clear if the protesters, activists, and opposition leaders have a capacity for a more sophisticated organization necessary to actually confront the regime and win. Pathological incompetence of the opposition is one of the reasons why shitty Eastern European autocrats stay in power for as long as they do. The Ukrainians managed to get rid of theirs, but they were well organized, and even then they had to make several attempts and many sacrifices. Another person in my gym expressed a concern that if Lukashenko is truly cornered and is without options, he might choose to go with the original plan, the Allied state. He might surrender to Putin, live the rest of his life in luxury somewhere in Moscow. Will Russia anschluss Belarus like they did Crimea? Seems unlikely, but I suppose there is a non-zero chance of that happening. The political map will remain as it is unless whoever emerges victorious in the power struggle will intensify and overdo the anti-Russian rhetoric up to a point when Vlad is forced to do something drastic. I don't think this would happen since Belarusian people don't display the same toxicity towards Russians as Ukrainians do. At least not yet. But if Belarus permanently shifts its political allegiance, reorienting itself towards the West, well, for one, the Russian media would be amazing to read. I can already hear the screeching. The proverbial fall of Belarus will accelerate Russian political and cultural decline. It might even delegitimize Vlad Putin. During the previous crises, there were so many of them, Vlad was able to evade the responsibility for the catastrophic collapse of Russian influence, blaming it on various legacy issues he inherited from Yeltsin and from the USSR. But not this time. Putin is in power for over 20 years now. The master strategist and the supposed puppeteer of the US president couldn't even control events in the neighboring Potato Republic. Should the protests intensify and escalate into a full-blown crisis, we will likely see activists from both Russia and Ukraine on the streets of Minsk. Personally, I'm excited, although I haven't decided yet which side I'll be on. Maybe I'll let a random number generator decide, or an internet poll. What would Vseslav the Sorcerer do in my place? Obviously, politics is complicated. There are many variables and uncertainties. The only thing we know for sure is that the world will end when the wolf will eat the moon.